Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here in Athens, one of the homes of medicine. I'm also from a city which has got a great reputation for medical innovation, Edinburgh, home to some of the earliest discoveries in terms of anesthesia and use of antisepsis and so on, and anatomy for that matter. It's been a long day for everybody, so I'm going to have a bit of fun with you, and I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about what we might predict for the future in healthcare. And I'm going to take healthcare quite widely, not just medical care, but actually all the different aspects of care that we all need as we start to age. And I'm going to do this by basically talking a little bit about innovation first and about the difficulty of understanding how things will develop in the future. And then I'm going to go into give you 7 predictions. Now, you could come up with 100 predictions of what's going to happen, and they might all be moderately right. But I feel quite confident about these 7. I'd like to see what you think of them as we go through. So, let's talk about innovation. And, you know, we humans are inventing things all the time. We're discovering, inventing, we're innovating, and we have a vision about how what we've invented and discovered might be really useful. And I love this quote from a Danish humorist, Robert Storm Peterson. Difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. It's much easier to go back in time in the future and then to say, actually, you know, we could have predicted that if we'd had a bit more insight. So it's really difficult, and I guess futurists always have this challenge that they may get it completely wrong, and some indeed have got it completely wrong. So here's a few historical technology-related predictions. Popular mechanics, 1949, computers in the future may weigh no more than 1.5 tons. So why was that prediction so wrong? Well, the whole technology base was utterly different. Computers were designed using valves and wires and great long looms and frames, and you know, the conception of the computer then was completely different. And it was only really the invention of the transistor by Shockley and then the further reinvention of that into integrated circuits that allowed us to micro-miniaturize and get them down to something you can wear on your wrist. There's no reason why anybody would want a computer in their home. Now, this is Ken Olsen, the very famous founder of Digital DEC, in 1977. That's not that long ago when you think about it. And again, you know, think back to those days. The people that had computers in their homes had probably built them themselves from a kit, and were certainly programming them themselves. And they had a very limited use. And now, of course, I challenge you to find almost any home on the planet that doesn't have a computer in it, even if it's just the mobile phone chip. 640K of memory ought to be enough for anybody. Bill Gates, Microsoft. Again, 81, memory was extremely expensive, and it's only because the cost of manufacturing of memory has come down so much that we can do much, much more now with the devices in our pockets and on our desks. And then one from IBM. I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. Why did he get that so wrong? Well, this is a bit of a misquote, because in fact he'd been around America talking to companies about his idea for a general purpose business computer, and he gathered from that mission that maybe 5 companies had the money, the resources, and the need to use a big computer. And in fact, we only sold about 5 computers in the few years after that, before things took off later in the 1950s. So you can get it wrong just by basing your assumptions on the technology we know today, the things that we know today. We have to escape from that. Here's a few more from other industries. This telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. This was Western Union, who did telegraphy. And of course, sometimes the telephone does have shortcomings when it comes to communication, but generally speaking, it's one of the things that's transformed our ability to communicate in business and in personal life. The wireless music box, the radio in other words, has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message to be sent to nobody in particular? So again, think about this. This is in the days when you would pay to send a message from A to B, and the idea that you just threw out information into the ether and somebody would catch it was not really well understood. Take these 2 ideas and put them together, and you've got the multi-trillion-dollar mobile phone industry, which we all now know about today. And the one at the bottom is really unforgivable. Everything that can be invented has been invented. This was the US Patent Office in 1899. It was the end of history for technology, and of course we know that was completely wrong. So, I want to show you what I think is the first example I can find of an eHealth in practice. This is an electrocardiogram. It was basically a device for measuring heart activity. The patient had to stand, or sit in this case, with an arm each side in buckets of saline solution and a foot in another one so they could get the signals. And this thing was really impressive. It was a big machine. It was very accurate. The trouble was that they couldn't actually always get the patient to the machine. The patient sometimes was stuck in a hospital bed. So what William Einthoven did was he ran a copper cable from the hospital bed, the hospital ward, to his lab, which was about 1.5 miles away, and was able to get the signals to the point where he could process them. You know, just a bit of lateral thinking. If we can't move the patient, let's just separate them. And this is, I think, one of the first practical examples of where we see the separation that eHealth allows between where the patient is and where the consulting doctor is with the data. Here's another very interesting historical artifact from 1924. And this is a real magazine cover, and a lot of people think, well, this is just made up because it couldn't possibly be true. But you can go back and look at it for yourself. There's a whole archive of these publications. And there we see a teleconsultation being predicted using not only radio, but also what looks suspiciously like a color television screen. Of course, the television was being developed around this time too, and the first commercially available TVs started appearing a couple of years later. But really, this is out of the brain of someone who did two things. His name was Hugo Gernsback. He both published these technology-focused magazines, Radio News, and he also wrote science fiction. He was really interested in this. So he was basically combining his left and right brain in a way and coming up with these what looked like fantastical ideas about how things might be in the future. And here we are, kind of predicting, you know, in a way, you know, Skype consultations over a distance, even though the technology is very different. So it's interesting to see, you know, how people think about these things into the future. Here's, you might be familiar with the Gartner telemedicine and virtual care hype cycle. They do lots of hype cycles. And the idea of the hype cycle is that every technology, after it's been triggered or invented, goes through this kind of wave motion. It goes up this very steep slope until it gets to what's called the peak of inflated expectation. So in other words, everything is overhyped. And then people realize it's not as useful as they thought, and then it falls down into the trough of disillusionment. But then eventually, for the ones that make it this far, and it can take years to get this far, they then get into what's called the slope of enlightenment, the plateau of productivity, and they become mainstream. And if you look at this chart, you'll see this is now 4 years old, and there's a slightly more up-to-date one. But I wanted to show you this one because it shows a whole range of different, you know, eHealth services, some of which are very well developed, even 4 years ago, remote ICU, teledermatology, telestroke, and some of which are still climbing up the curve here. Interestingly, they actually decided that mHealth was obsolete before the plateau, which I think was probably a big mistake because, as we now know, mHealth is actually a pretty important and inspiring area of eHealth. So, is this correct? Does this actually reflect in what happens in reality? Well, you might say that telemedicine is still very much a niche thing in medicine. It's not all that common compared to face-to-face appointments. But take a look at this. This is a photograph of Mercy Virtual. It's a hospital. It's a hospital that has no beds and no patients. Where are the doctors? Where are the white coats? Where are the stethoscopes? There's none of that. These are clinicians who are basically looking after patients at a distance, and that's all they do. They never see a patient face to face. This is a $54 million investment in Missouri, in the United States. There are 330 clinicians and nurses working here, and they provide all the things that you can do from a center such as this. They do ICU, intensive care unit monitoring, for other hospitals. They do home monitoring for people with chronic conditions. They do nurse on call, telestroke. So I think, you know, is this the future? Well, this is the beginning of the future. And you can imagine that as time goes on, we'll see hospitals shrink quite a bit, and we'll start to see more and more of these dedicated facilities. And what's driving a lot of this, in the same way as it's driving it in other industries, are these technological drivers or revolutions which are creating digital disruption. The mobile revolution, the mobile phone with its immediacy, its location awareness, and the ability to innovate really fast as a developer and get apps out there through the various catalogs, iTunes and so forth. Internet of Things, the idea of putting sensors into the home, into the environment, into our cars, onto our bodies, into our bodies in some cases. Again, massively interesting area, and I'll come back to this shortly. Power of analytics, we've now got the techniques to actually process data in very different ways from the conventional ways that we've thought about it in the past, particularly going beyond just statistical methods. And then cloud computing, which basically allows us to stand up and to deliver applications which, if they're then successful, can be scaled up really fast. And for me, this is very democratizing. This allows people with big ideas to get started really quickly and to scale up as soon as they become more popular. So this has already had massive effects on the taxi industry with Uber, on the hotel industry with Airbnb, on the music industry with iTunes. You can just see healthcare, there are areas of healthcare where this will really start to have an impact, and I think we have to watch very closely for where this takes root. So, in essence, I think that technology has the potential to do three things for us when it comes to our care systems. We can transform the ambition, design, and operation. We can stand back and say, now that we don't have to do things this way, let's do them another way. Let's actually design services that are more convenient, safer, and more cost-effective. It has the potential to give us all more control of our own health, including well-being and the issues of aging, and I'll come onto that shortly. And finally, we can use all different classes of data, what's in the medical record, the data we generate about ourselves, the data generated every day on social media. We can start to bring this together in a way that allows us to make care better for the individuals. So here's my 7 predictions. I'm going to go through fairly quickly. One is that in the next 5 to 10 years, which is the time period that we're talking about here, many care systems, not all, but many, will start to use data proactively to manage population and individual health risks. This is known as population health management. And the concept here very much is that today, the people that show up for healthcare have selected themselves, either because they don't feel well or because they stepped out in front of a car and got a broken leg. They are people who have some need that they want to express and they want to have a medical opinion on it. That's fine for lots of things, but we all know that many people that go to see the doctor don't need to see the doctor. They're there because they're just worried about their health. They're not actually ill. But even more importantly, a lot of people that don't see the doctor are sick, but they just don't get involved with the medical side until the crisis happens. They have a stroke, a heart attack, or worse. So we have to start thinking about the population as, if you like, a group of individuals who have various stages of their health journey. There are various stages. They may be completely well, in which case you just want to prevent health risks. It's about public health management, so it's about education and engaging people and keeping well. You may have people who have started to develop risks of things like hypertension, for example, and for those you want to be able to predict who those people are in the population and reach out to them. And for the people at the right end of the diagram who already are symptomatic and maybe even getting towards end of life, this is the group that you really want to focus your very rare human resources on, because in a way you can start to automate a lot of the other things on the left-hand side. Why have a nurse on the phone calling around to bring people in for their annual flu jab when you can just use text messaging, or you can just use Facebook, or whatever it is the individual will respond to? So I think this is going to be a very important move, because it moves the focus away from we care for people that turn up at the door to we care for the whole population all of the time, using what we know about them because of the data that we have. So this is a real kind of reversal of thinking about how we use health data. And I think it's going to be incredibly important in primary care and in reforming how primary care operates within a community. we all are very aware of the fact that, we're all, hopefully many of us are living to an old age now, into 80s, 90s and beyond. That's fantastic. That's great progress for medical science. The issue, though, is that, as this graph from Scottish data shows from 4 years ago, this is a third of the population of Scotland in a given year. They showed that as you get into these higher and higher age cohorts, you are going to inevitably have more and more conditions to deal with. Again, that in itself is not necessarily bad news, because we have the ability to deal with chronic conditions. We have drugs, we have devices, we have strategies and methods. The problem is that a lot of patients, as they age, get very complex because they have lots of things going on with them, and then you have to start thinking about them in terms of the whole range of needs, and you have to make some compromises. If a patient is going to see a cardiologist one day, an endocrinologist the next day, and a physical therapist the next day, they're going to get 3 lots of advice from these specialists, some of which may be completely incompatible. So what do we do about that? Well, my second prediction is that we have to have this idea of more integrated care, especially for the complex patients, delivered by multidisciplinary teams, including the patients themselves, with real-time shared care plans. So you can imagine that, in the ideal world, you'd want to have a care plan that you've developed with the person with the complex conditions, which is transparent and visible to those who are allowed to see it. And that care team will include the patient, maybe their family members, certainly the primary care doctor, the specialist. Therefore, from an IT point of view, we have to start creating systems that allow you to do this. Most of our systems today that we've invested in are systems of record. They're record-keeping systems, patient record systems, patient admin systems. Use them for looking back at what happened and for billing purposes. What we need are systems now which actually have a living plan within them, which can collaborate, a bit more like bringing Facebook together with your EPR. You want something, a place where people can share information safely and securely, but allow it to be updated in real time, to be reviewed. And so everybody who knows about the individual knows enough about them not to harm them, and ideally to give them even better outcome. So I think we'll see, and I hope we'll see, a proliferation of these systems of engagement in the future that use health data but put them into a collaborative network like this. Number 3, each of us will be engaged across the life course, birth to death, as owners and co-creators of our own health. Now, this is very apparent to me when I go to the United States. The number of people I see there who are wearing, Fitbits and such like, and many of them are doing it out of curiosity. But the fact is that we are, as humans, giving off signals all the time, and we need to understand what can we do with these signals. It's all very well going to your doctor once every 6 months to have your blood pressure checked. That's a good thing to do. I would recommend it. But wouldn't it be better to have your blood pressure continuously assessed by you and by an algorithm that can understand what it means for you? I spoke with some cardiologists a few weeks ago, and they said that these random blood pressure tests are meaningless. There's no context there, and often they're elevated because of the white coat syndrome. So wouldn't it be better to have a device that can basically do this for you continuously? So I think what we're saying here is that we now have the devices and the power in our pockets, particularly in mobile phones, to do much more with the data that we are emanating all the time, if we choose to do that. Some unfortunate people, of course, who are chronically monitored are used to doing this. They're used to, diabetics and people with end-stage disease are often, like COPD, they're often monitored with devices provided by the healthcare system. But what about us beginning to use what we already have on our bodies to do more? So you'll be aware of wearables in the terms of health and fitness apps, and these are good things in that they make us understand how active we are. And it's been said that with a lot of these devices, they last for about 6 months, and then people stop using them. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, I think after 6 months, many of them have told you what they're going to tell you. They've told you how many steps that you do, and they told you how often you do it, and they tell you why and which days, and it's quite kind of useful. But then they kind of run out of steam because they're not really engaging enough. So I think what we're going to see is maybe picking up some of the ideas from the quantified self movement. These are the people who are extreme extreme wearable people. They wear wearables all over their bodies, and they're there to try and measure everything. But we can take some of the ideas out of that for applications that engage us and keep us wanting to come back and just for more. And therefore, there's fantastic potential for innovation in this area for small companies to come up with these things that are going to keep our attention. And this is about physical health. If you think about the other area that we tend to kind of separate out, even though they're really not separate in reality, is mental health. And here's a couple of devices that I came across last year. In fact, I've been using both of them in a clinical trial to see whether they're really as effective as they sound. What do? The one on the top right-hand side is an EEG. You wear it across your headband like this, like a pair of glasses. It's a 7-lead EEG, and it basically monitors your brain activity and turns it into a soundscape. It's like a virtual reality thing, and it's used for meditating. So this has no claims to being a medical device, but it does claim to be a way of helping you to meditate and therefore deal with stress better. The one at the bottom, the Spire, is something you wear on your belt. You clip it onto your belt or your bra, and it measures respiration, and it turns the respiration rate and the frequency and speed of that into one of 3 states: focused, calm, or tense. Now, at the end of each day, it will show you very visually on your phone how long you were tense for, how long you were focused for, how long you were calm for. And you can go back through the day and you can ask, why was I tense? What was I doing that made me tense? And you can start to understand, again, what is it that's making me ill? And what can I do about that? So these are kind of very interesting developments, I think, and there's a lot more of this to come. I think in the next 5 years in particular, we'll see a proliferation of these wearable devices which will communicate with each other and then interact with us in a much more intelligent way. Number 4, the Internet of Things will enable smart homes, advanced telemetry, and robotics to support aging in place. I've already said that aging comes with some downsides, and one of those is the fact that it becomes more difficult to live independently, especially as most of our houses are not designed with aging in mind. Some of them are, but many of them are really not. So can we do more to put devices into homes to monitor what is often called the activities of daily living? So we're not looking at health here, we're just looking at, did this person wake up and put on the kettle? Did they move around? Or are they lying on the floor? Or are they still in bed? Or are they not eating? We can start to look at these things, not because we want to snoop on people, but basically because they want to feel that someone is keeping an eye on them, that they want to be safe. And we ran this project in the city of Bolzano in northern Italy a few years ago. We've just scaled it up. We've got an agreement to scale it up. And we're basically putting sensors into the home which are hidden. You wouldn't know they were there, but they're basically measuring simple things like energy usage and CO2 in the atmosphere as a proxy for activity and so on. You know all about telemedicine, of course, and we've discussed that already. And then we've got this new idea of robotics and domestic robots. Here's a couple of them. This is the one in the middle is called Pepper. You may know Pepper. He's what's called an affective or an emotional robot. Doesn't do anything useful except talk to you. But the interesting thing about these robots is they can become companions because they can respond to your emotions and they can change the way they speak to you based on how you look to them. So we're getting into kind of a very interesting, different kind of way of thinking about how we collaborate with robots, and in this case with a computer system behind it. And then we've got things like Robert for carrying people. Now, this is not a very sensible way to carry anybody, I've been told, but you can just see the potential for robotics to come into everyday life. And in Japan, where they have a very old population at the moment, robotics are a very significant factor in helping people to live independently. Number 5, the health data will be liberated and put to work for our benefit. So I've already said that we've now got these huge number of new and numerous data sources, which can be signals, they can be images, they can be videos, they can be text, they can be structured data from the medical record. We've got new platforms for collaborating, the mobile platforms in particular, and we've got analytics innovations where we can go beyond just looking at what happened to trying to use algorithms to predict what is going to happen. And this gives us the chance to really put this data to work. And you can think of so many use cases, but I've just picked out a few here which are obvious ones. Clearly, you want to push a lot of this data into medical research. You want to give the researchers an understanding of illness and illness progression and the causation of illness, and fantastic potential to generate more contextual data about us rather than just the lab tests and the blood tests and so on that we take today. Real-world evidence in the pharma sector, the idea of being able to not only put your drug into a market but understand how well it's working and to justify the cost of the drug on the basis that you're really delivering results. Precision medicine, being able to know enough about an individual, even down to the genetic level, to be able to say whether or not a drug is actually going to work. And as we get more into molecular drugs and in the treatment of cancer and other diseases, I think this we need to generate this contextual data too. And finally, healthcare system improvement. How well is the whole system working? Are there quality variations, access problems? A lot of healthcare systems are sitting on this data, and although they use it, it tends to be 6 to 12 months out of date by the time they get around to using it. So can we speed this whole thing up and make it faster? And this data has fantastic economic value. The World Economic Forum 5 years ago spoke about personal data being a new asset class. So think of the data that we're generating and capturing about ourselves as being a national asset that we can then use to attract investment, to set up new companies, and to move on and get economic value back from it. Number 6, I'm nearly done. New services will be created to meet the demands of an older population. And this is one I really like. This is a real service. This is not the future. It's a service called Call and Check, and it's based on the idea of this man in the middle, Joe Dickinson, on the little island of Jersey off the south coast of England, that the postal workers are getting less and less revenue from their mail deliveries. So wouldn't it be great if instead of just delivering letters, they could also deliver a conversation? Press the doorbell, engage the person in conversation, ask, how are you feeling? Did you sleep well last night? Have you got enough medication? Do you need me to set up a doctor's appointment? What is it that I can do for you? And as they're capturing this, they can actually visualize and see, does this person look confused, depressed, thin? They can start to make assessments. Now, these are not healthcare workers. They're not intended to be nurses, but they can take that insight and take it back into the care system. And by giving the postal workers devices to automate what they do at the doorstep, they can immediately be capturing what's going on, and the families can know, the doctors can know, the social workers can get involved if necessary. This is just a great idea to take people whose job is going to go out of use within the next 5 years and to repurpose them for something which is a real social good. And we've done something similar to this, a little bit different flavor in Japan with Apple. So IBM, Apple, and Japan Post last year got together and they announced that we're developing these iPads and custom applications. Now, a lot of people say, well, eHealth is only for the people who like technology, but actually, that's not true. A lot of older people are very comfortable with using iPads as long as they're simple and foolproof. So can we develop these apps that allow you to connect to your bank, to your doctor, to your family? And can we develop companion apps, which we've been doing, so the family can know how the parent's getting on with their iPad? So this is a really interesting development because, again, it's about trying to reduce social isolation and to trying to keep people connected with all the services and other people who are going to make their life pleasant. And the final one, which I guess many of you would be expecting me to talk about being from IBM, is the Watson project. So my prediction here is that not just thinking about Watson, but in general, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and cognitive computing will support the development of personalized healthcare and precision medicine. The Watson project came out of IBM Research. What is it? Well, it's a system that you train rather than program. And these are the characteristics that it has. First of all, these systems understand natural language. They can read and understand millions of pages of unstructured text, medical journals, medical histories, in a few seconds. They can generate and evaluate evidence-based hypotheses, a bit like a doctor does. Basically, what does this case suggest to me? What are the likely diagnoses? And it's a machine learning system, so it gets better over time. The more cases you give it, the better it gets at analyzing them. There was a recent news item you may have seen in Japan where a woman who'd been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia wasn't responding, and we brought Watson into play. We took a look at the medical history, we compared it with 20 million other similar cases, and we changed the diagnosis, and the woman then responded. So this was a kind of an interesting example of Watson basically giving an improved diagnosis over the original doctor's decision. And I think this is this is the beginning of maybe a bit more trust and faith in this kind of technology, which we need. Watson won't replace doctors, at least in my opinion it won't replace doctors, because it doesn't do all the things that doctors do. Humans are great at having common sense, like we heard in one of the earlier presentations, dilemmas, we can deal with morals, we have compassion, we have imagination, we can dream, we can abstract, and we can generalize. We're really, really good at doing all this kind of thing. Cognitive systems are great at reading and understanding vast amounts of knowledge, pattern identification, looking for the hidden patterns in all of this, locating where the knowledge is, improving their performance, eliminating bias. And remember, doctors have this, I don't know whether you've read the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, about the two systems that we use to understand and make decisions. Watson and systems like it have no pride. They're happy to change their diagnosis in a flash if they get more data. And they have endless capacity to work. So, we have to think of this not as a replacement, but as a kind of a way of augmenting what the doctor does and improving it, hopefully, and changing the way that doctors interact with computers to make it more fruitful. We've developed a whole ecosystem around this idea, and we've now got relationships with some of these companies you see up here to develop new services for joint replacement, for managing diabetes, for fitness, for diabetes. The idea of this is really to use this technology as widely as we possibly can and get people really interested in it. So here are my 7 predictions for the next 10 years. If I'm still around, I'd be happy to come back to Athens in 2026 and see how close I was to them. I just want to finish with one final thing, which is, our systems of care need to innovate because we're dealing with a big challenge now, and we have to throw all the creativity we can at it. ICT will enable the transformation to happen. It's not the thing that will cause it. It will enable the things we want to do to be possible. But it's not just about the tech. It requires leadership, political leadership, policy making, and so on. It requires incentives so that we are all given the reasons to want to change. And it requires new service ideas that really do have value, and not just more gadgets, but actually have some measurable value. So with that, I'd like to thank you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you.